Barack and Michelle Obama were kicked out of an elite restaurant. The staff had no idea who was in front of them, but their humiliating behavior had unexpected consequences. What happened next shocked everyone. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching us from. The cool evening air of the city carried a hum of life as Barack and Michelle Obama strolled down the bustling streets. The sidewalk was alive with energy, street performers strumming guitars, tourists pausing to snap photos, and the faint aroma of food carts wafting through the air. It was one of those rare moments when the couple could blend in, their presence unnoticed by most, offering them a fleeting taste of anonymity. They had just left a charity fundraiser, where polished speeches and flashing cameras had filled the night. Now, dressed down in jeans and casual jackets, they felt a rare sense of freedom, savoring the chance to walk without an entourage. Michelle paused near a corner boutique, gazing through the glass at a minimalist jewelry display, but Barack gently nudged her forward. "How about we save the shopping for another day?" he suggested with a smile. She laughed and nodded, her hand slipping naturally into his as they continued down the block. As they walked, they exchanged thoughts about the event they had just left, the donors, the speeches, and the ongoing challenges of sustaining charitable programs. Yet, as the night unfolded, Barack suggested something simple. "What if we finish the evening with dinner somewhere quiet?" Michelle agreed without hesitation. "Something cozy but elegant," she said, her eyes scanning the storefronts. That's when they spotted it, a high-end restaurant nestled between two designer shops. Its name, etched in gold across a glass sign above the entrance, seemed to hum with exclusivity. The warm light spilling through the windows revealed crisp white tablecloths, glittering chandeliers, and impeccably dressed patrons sipping glasses of wine. Barack raised an eyebrow. "Looks fancy. You sure?" Michelle smirked. "You're asking me if I'm sure about dinner?" "Always." Neither of them called ahead, and neither considered whether their casual clothes would raise eyebrows. After all, hadn't they earned the right to an unassuming night out? Without hesitation, Barack opened the door and held it for Michelle as they stepped inside. The atmosphere shifted immediately. The murmur of conversation in the dining room dipped as eyes flickered toward the entrance. Michelle caught the briefest pause in a waiter's step, and Barack felt the weight of glances that lingered just a moment too long before being hurriedly averted. Behind a sleek marble podium, the hostess looked up from her tablet. Her uniform, perfectly tailored black with a small gold pin, matched the decor's polished aesthetic. But it wasn't just the cut of her blazer that radiated exclusivity. It was the way her expression subtly hardened as she took in their appearance. Barack wore dark jeans and a button-down shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows. Michelle's outfit was equally simple, a navy blouse and slacks paired with comfortable flats. Neither screamed wealth or influence. They didn't need to. Yet the hostess's eyes swept over them, pausing briefly on Michelle's shoes before returning to Barack's face. Her smile barely shifted, but something about it sharpened, as if suddenly defensive. "Good evening," she said, her voice rehearsed. "Do you have a reservation?" Barack smiled warmly. "We don't, but we're hoping you might have a table for two available." The hostess's fingers hovered above the tablet screen, then dropped to her side. "I'm so sorry, but we're completely booked tonight." Michelle tilted her head slightly. Through the large window, she could clearly see at least two empty tables near the far corner of the dining room. Yet she said nothing, instead watching how the hostess's composure remained frozen in place. "Ah, that's too bad," Barack said. He let the silence linger for a moment. The hostess shifted slightly, her weight transferring from one foot to the other. If you'd like, I could check for cancellations, but I can't guarantee. Michelle stepped forward, cutting her off with a gracious but firm smile. We don't mind waiting. There was the faintest flicker of hesitation before the hostess gestured toward the bar. Of course, you're welcome to wait there. They were led to a corner near the bar, far from the main dining area. The stools were sturdy but lacked the plush upholstery of the dining chairs. A subtle signal. This was not where valued guests dined. The bartender greeted them with a strained smile, offering water and a drinks menu without asking if they'd like to see the full dinner menu. As Barack flipped through the list of wines, Michelle scanned the room. The restaurant wasn't crowded. In fact, the staff seemed to have plenty of time to hover around guests who clearly belonged. She noticed a waiter refilling a glass of champagne at one table while chatting effortlessly with a couple dressed in evening attire. Across the room, a manager leaned in close to whisper something to a server, glancing in their direction before disappearing into the back. Michelle leaned in slightly toward Barack. They're not used to seeing people like us here. Barack smirked, his tone light but laced with recognition. We'll see how long it takes before they figure it out. The drinks arrived slowly, and when Michelle asked for a menu, the bartender hesitated before producing one. Are you sure you want to order here? He asked. Most people like to wait for a proper table. Michelle didn't blink. We'll take the menu. The bartender nodded and walked away without another word. Michelle turned the pages slowly, pretending to consider her options, but what she really noticed was the growing tension around them. The hostess reappeared after 20 minutes, feigning enthusiasm. Still no openings, I'm afraid, she said, though her tone lacked genuine regret. Barack glanced at his watch. We'll give it a little longer. Michelle noticed how the hostess's eyes narrowed slightly, her gaze flickering toward the bartender as if signaling something unspoken. The waiter who arrived next carried the kind of politeness that felt sharp around the edges. He refilled their water glasses, but lingered too long, as if waiting for a sign that they should leave. Michelle resisted the urge to speak up, but she didn't miss the way her husband's jaw tightened. Barack rarely lost his temper, but she could feel the undercurrent of frustration beneath his calm demeanor. They both understood what was happening. This wasn't just about a full dining room or strict reservation policies. It was about appearances, who looked like they belonged and who didn't. Michelle took out her phone and snapped a picture of the menu, something she often did to remember dishes she wanted to try later. The faint sound of the shutter seemed to ripple through the staff's quiet murmur, and still they waited. By the time the bartender returned to clear their glasses, his tone carried a finality. I'm afraid we can't hold space at the bar much longer, he said. Barack stood, his expression neutral. That won't be necessary. As Michelle rose to join him, she saw the hostess glance toward the manager, who nodded ever so slightly. It was subtle, but undeniable, a silent dismissal. Michelle turned to Barack as they stepped toward the exit. This isn't over, she said quietly. He met her gaze and gave a slight nod, not even close. The door swung shut behind them, but the evening was far from finished. Barack and Michelle stepped outside into the cool evening air, the door of the restaurant clicking shut behind them. The noise of the city rushed back in, horns blaring, laughter echoing from passing groups of friends, and the low hum of conversations from sidewalk cafes. Yet the sound seemed distant, muffled by the lingering sting of what had just happened inside. Michelle's hands clenched at her sides as she took a slow breath, her jaw tight. Barack, always steady, reached out and touched her arm gently. She turned to him, her eyes sharp and searching. "I know," he said softly, "but let's go back." Her eyebrows lifted. "Back? They'll recognize us soon enough." He gestured to the window, where inside the restaurant, the hostess was speaking in hushed tones to the bartender. Her body language was tense, her eyes flicking toward the entrance as if afraid they might return. Michelle hesitated for just a moment before nodding. "All right," she said, "let's do it." They re-entered the restaurant with deliberate calm, and the soft chime above the door seemed louder this time, causing several heads to turn. The bartender froze mid-pour, and the hostess straightened so quickly that her clipboard nearly slipped from her grasp. "Welcome back," she said, though the words carried an edge, as if she were unsure whether she was greeting guests or facing intruders. Michelle smiled politely, refusing to acknowledge the tension. "We've decided to stay after all," she said, her voice measured. The hostess opened her mouth as if to object, but then caught herself. "Of course. Let me see what I can do." This time she didn't pretend to check the schedule. Instead, she led them past the bar, deeper into the dining area, and toward a small table near the kitchen doors. It was the least desirable seat in the room, close to the noise of clattering dishes and the smell of cooking food. Michelle glanced at Barack, who gave her a slight nod. They sat down without complaint, but the hostess lingered just long enough to make it clear that their presence still felt unwelcome. A waiter appeared moments later, carrying water glasses and menus. He too seemed uncertain, his movements hesitant. "I'll give you a few minutes," he said, setting the menus down and disappearing almost as quickly as he had arrived. Michelle picked up the menu and opened it slowly. She could feel the eyes on her, the subtle glances from nearby tables and the staff who hovered near the bar, speaking in hushed tones. Barack leaned back in his chair, his expression calm, but his gaze sharp as he took in the room. He saw how one waiter nudged another, whispering something as they both glanced in their direction. He saw the bartender peek over the counter, pretending to wipe glasses, but clearly eavesdropping. "They're still watching us," Michelle murmured without looking up from her menu. Barack smiled faintly. "Let them." The minutes ticked by, and the waiter didn't return. Nearby tables were served bread and appetizers, but their table remained bare. Michelle's patience began to fray. She closed the menu and set it down, her fingers tapping softly against the tablecloth. "Let's see how long this lasts," Barack said, his tone light but his meaning clear. 10 more minutes passed before the waiter finally returned, looking flustered. "I'm so sorry for the delay," he said quickly, as though he had just been reminded to check on them. "Are you ready to order?" Michelle didn't miss the slight tremor in his voice, nor the way his eyes darted to the bar where the manager was now standing. "We are," Barack said, handing him the menus. The waiter scribbled down their choices and rushed off, leaving them once again to the quiet tension of the room. Michelle looked at Barack and leaned in slightly. "This isn't just bad service," she said softly. "This is intentional." Barack's expression darkened slightly. "I know." As they waited, the murmurs around them seemed to grow louder. A table nearby broke into laughter, and Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that it was directed at them. Her stomach tightened, but she forced herself to keep her posture straight, refusing to show any sign of discomfort. A manager finally approached. He was older than the others, with graying hair and a crisp suit. His smile was polite, but his eyes betrayed a thin layer of condescension. "I wanted to personally apologize for the delay," he said, clasping his hands together. We're experiencing some unexpected issues tonight, and I hope you'll understand." Michelle smiled back, her expression warm but unreadable. "Of course. These things happen." The manager seemed almost disappointed by her composure, as though he had expected her to snap or demand answers. Instead, she gave him nothing to latch onto. As he walked away, Michelle noticed the bartender watching them closely. When their meals finally arrived, they were set down with forced smiles and murmured apologies. Yet the tension in the room never dissipated. Michelle ate slowly, her appetite dulled by the weight of the experience. Barack remained steady, but she could see the flicker of irritation in his eyes every time the waiter hesitated before approaching their table. When the check arrived, Barack reached for his wallet and slid a credit card into the leather folder. The waiter glanced at it, his eyes widening slightly as he read the name embossed in gold. He froze. It was subtle, but Michelle saw it, the tightening of his shoulders, the sudden shift in his demeanor. He walked away quickly, disappearing behind the bar, and within moments the manager reappeared, his face pale. "Mr. Obama, Barack held up a hand, cutting him off gently but firmly. "We're all set, thank you." The manager hesitated, then nodded and retreated. Michelle looked at Barack as he signed the bill. "They know," she said quietly. He smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "They do." They stood, and once again the room seemed to still. Conversations faltered, eyes turned. But this time Michelle didn't feel invisible. She felt exposed. As they walked toward the exit, she caught the hostess staring, her expression tight with embarrassment. Michelle met her gaze and held it just long enough to see her look away. Outside, the night air felt heavier than before. Michelle exhaled slowly, her breath fogging in the cold. "This isn't over," she said, echoing her words from earlier. Barack's hand found hers. "No," he agreed. "It's not." They began walking, leaving the glow of the restaurant behind them. But even as they moved through the busy streets, the weight of what had happened stayed with them, a quiet humiliation that demanded to be answered. The city buzzed around them as Barack and Michelle Obama walked down the crowded sidewalk, their steps slower than usual. The glow of neon signs reflected off the wet pavement, and voices blended into an indistinct hum, but Michelle barely noticed. Her thoughts spun in circles, replaying every moment of their time in the restaurant, the cold looks, the patronizing tone of the hostess, the deliberate delay in service. Barack walked beside her, his hands in his pockets, his expression calm but pensive. He knew Michelle well enough to recognize the storm brewing beneath her composed exterior. Finally, she stopped. They were outside another cafe, its windows fogged from the heat inside. She turned to face him, her voice quiet but firm. "We're going back." Barack didn't need to ask why. He saw it in her eyes, the resolve, the refusal to let this slide. He gave a slight nod and gestured down the street. "Let's do it." They retraced their steps, moving with purpose this time. When the restaurant came into view, Michelle slowed, drawing in a steadying breath. The glow of the chandeliers inside seemed brighter now, almost blinding against the dark city street. As they stepped through the door, the chime overhead seemed louder than before, cutting through the soft murmur of conversation. Heads turned. Conversations faltered. The bartender paused mid-pour, and the hostess stiffened behind her podium. Michelle felt the weight of the room shift as eyes settled on them, but she didn't flinch. The hostess forced a smile, though her fingers tightened on the clipboard she held. "Welcome back," she said, her voice edged with nerves. Michelle stepped forward, her gaze steady. "We've decided to stay." There was a flicker of panic in the hostess's eyes. "Of course. Let me see what we have available." She didn't even look at her tablet this time. Instead, she turned sharply, disappearing toward the back of the restaurant. Barack and Michelle waited, their presence like a ripple spreading through the room. They could feel it, the unease, the whispers, the stolen glances. When the hostess returned, she was accompanied by a man in a dark suit with silver at his temples, the restaurant's manager. He approached with a practiced smile, but Michelle could see the tension in his shoulders, the tightness around his eyes. "Mr. and Mrs. Obama," he began, his voice carefully measured. "We're so sorry about earlier. We had no idea." Michelle raised a hand, stopping him. "No idea who we were?" The manager hesitated. That's exactly the point," Michelle said, her tone sharp but controlled. "It shouldn't matter who we are." The manager blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. Behind him, the bartender hovered nervously, and the hostess shifted her weight from foot to foot. Barack stepped closer, his presence grounding the moment. "We're here because we wanted to have dinner like any other couple," he said, "and we were treated as if we didn't belong." The manager's smile faltered. "I assure you, that wasn't our intention." Michelle cut him off. "Intentions don't erase the impact." The room had grown quieter now. Other guests were straining to listen, pretending not to notice but failing. Michelle felt their eyes, their curiosity, and perhaps their unease. "We waited longer than anyone else for service," Michelle continued. "We were seated in the worst part of the restaurant. We were ignored and judged before we even had a chance to order. And then, when we tried to pay, your staff panicked." The manager's face flushed. He opened his mouth, but Michelle didn't let him speak. "What I want to know," she said, "is whether this would have happened if we looked different, if we dressed differently, if we fit your idea of who belongs here." The silence stretched. The manager glanced toward the hostess, who looked down, avoiding his gaze. Finally, he spoke. "We take pride in treating every guest with the utmost respect." Michelle's eyes narrowed. "Do you?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Barack's voice broke the silence. "We're not looking for an apology," he said. "We're looking for accountability." The manager shifted nervously, but Barack's calm steadiness seemed to root him in place. "This isn't just about us," Michelle added. "It's about everyone who's been treated this way and didn't have the platform to call it out." The weight of her words settled over the room. The manager nodded slowly, his face pale. "I understand." Michelle wasn't sure he did. Not fully, but she wasn't done yet. "We'll be leaving now," she said, stepping back. "But I want you to know this isn't over." The manager opened his mouth again, but she didn't wait. She turned and walked toward the door, Barack following close behind. The whispers started as soon as they reached the entrance. Michelle could hear them, feel the shift in the air as the tension broke. But she didn't look back. Outside, the cold air hit her, sharp and bracing. She let out a slow breath and turned to Barack. "I need to do something about this," she said. He nodded. "We will." They walked away from the restaurant, the city lights blurring around them. Michelle's heart pounded, not from anger, but from resolve. She didn't know exactly what form their response would take yet, but she knew this moment couldn't be left to fade. It wasn't just about what had happened to them. It was about everyone who had ever been made to feel invisible, unwelcome, or unworthy. And it wasn't over, not even close. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows of the Obamas' townhouse, casting soft shadows on the polished wooden floors. Michelle sat at the kitchen table, her phone resting beside a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. She scrolled through her messages, the events of the previous night replaying in her mind with a sharp clarity that refused to fade. The restaurant had felt like a test, one she hadn't expected but had faced all the same. And now, as her phone continued to buzz, it was clear that the world was beginning to hear about it. Her inbox was already flooded with messages from friends, colleagues, and acquaintances. Some were outraged, others sympathetic, but a surprising number included stories, personal accounts of humiliation and exclusion in spaces meant to exude luxury. Michelle picked up her phone and opened one of the messages. "Mrs. Obama, I'm sorry this happened to you, but I can't say I'm surprised. I work retail in a high-end store and I see this kind of thing every day. People like me, black, working class, or just not dressed the right way, are treated as if we don't belong. Thank you for speaking up. Maybe now someone will listen." Her thumb hovered over the screen as another message came through. "I can't tell you how many times I've walked into a store and been ignored because of my skin color. Once, I was followed by security the entire time I shopped. It's humiliating, but you've given me hope that things can change." Michelle set her phone down and rubbed her temples. The weight of their words pressed against her, hope and anger woven together. She had spent years advocating for equality, working to dismantle the barriers that divided people, and yet here was proof that those walls still stood firm. Barack entered the kitchen, his tie slightly loose as he adjusted his cufflinks. "You've been up for a while," he said, pouring himself coffee. Michelle looked up, her expression determined. "People are already talking," she said. "It's spreading." Barack nodded. "I saw it too. Twitter's on fire." He held up his phone. The top trending hashtags read #RespectMatters, #ObamaSpeaks, and #Equality in Service. Michelle exhaled slowly. "It's not just about us," she said. "Look at these messages." She handed him her phone and he scrolled through them, his brow furrowing as he read. "It's bigger than one restaurant," he said. "This is systemic." "Exactly." Michelle leaned forward, her voice gaining strength. "And we can't let this moment pass. If we don't push this conversation further, it'll fade into the news cycle, and nothing will change." Barack studied her for a moment, then nodded. "So, what's the plan?" Michelle stood and grabbed her laptop. "I'm writing a statement. We'll release it today." He smiled. "That's my girl." By mid-afternoon, Michelle's words were live. She didn't name the restaurant. That wasn't the point. Instead, her post focused on the bigger issue, the quiet, insidious ways people were judged and excluded, not because of what they did, but because of who they were and how they looked. "What happened to me last night is not unique. It happens every day to people without the privilege of a platform or a recognizable name. It's subtle, but powerful. It's the look that says you don't belong. It's the assumption that your presence is a mistake. It's the refusal to see your worth. This isn't just about one restaurant. It's about the culture we've built that allows these moments to happen over and over again. And it's time we talk about it." Within hours, the post had gone viral. Celebrities and influencers reshared it, adding their own experiences. Journalists reached out for interviews and networks debated the broader implications of what Michelle had said. But it was the comments that struck her the most. "I was denied service because they thought I couldn't afford it. Security followed me the entire time I was shopping. I had to show ID just to prove I belonged in my own neighborhood. The floodgates had opened. By evening, the restaurant issued a public apology, acknowledging the incident without naming names. They promised to review their policies and provide bias training for their staff. But Michelle knew it wasn't enough. She sat on the couch that night, her phone still lighting up every few seconds with new notifications. Barack sat beside her, his arm resting along the back of the couch. "Do you think they'll actually change?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Barack didn't answer right away. "Some will," he said finally, "and some won't. But it's not about them. It's about the people who saw what happened and realized they're not alone. That's what matters." Michelle nodded, her gaze fixed on the screen as another notification popped up. This one was from a young woman in Atlanta. "I work in a restaurant, and I've seen what you described. I even caught myself treating people differently without realizing it. Your story made me think. I'm going to do better." Michelle smiled faintly, her resolve strengthening. The next morning, she took the first step toward turning the conversation into action. She reached out to her contacts, journalists, activists, and advocates she trusted. She scheduled interviews and started organizing a virtual town hall to give people a platform to share their stories. By the end of the day, plans were in motion. The conversation wasn't going away. That night, Michelle stood by the window, looking out over the city. The lights stretched endlessly, each one representing a life, a story, a voice that deserved to be heard. She had no illusions that change would come quickly. She knew there would be resistance, criticism, and attempts to downplay what had happened. But as long as people were willing to speak up, as long as they kept pushing, progress was possible. Barack joined her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "Ready for what's next?" he asked. She looked at him, her eyes steady. "Always." Outside, the city buzzed on. But for the first time since that night in the restaurant, Michelle felt something shift. The tide was turning. Michelle sat at her desk, the soft glow of the desk lamp illuminating the carefully arranged papers spread out before her. The night outside was quiet, but her thoughts churned with purpose. The weight of the previous day lingered, heavy yet sharp, a reminder that the story unfolding around her had grown larger than the walls of that restaurant. Her laptop screen glowed, the blinking cursor waiting as if daring her to find the words to match the urgency she felt. She leaned back in her chair, hands clasped together as she reread the drafts she had prepared earlier. Each version seemed to fall short, either too soft to capture the indignation she felt, or too sharp to carry the measured authority the moment demanded. Barack entered the room, a steaming mug of tea in his hand. He placed it beside her and leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. "You're thinking too hard about this," he said, smiling as he pulled up a chair. Michelle exhaled and shook her head. "I can't afford to get this wrong," she replied. "This can't just be about me. It has to be bigger." Barack nodded, leaning back in his seat. "Then write what you know. Write what you've seen." Michelle turned back to the screen, Barack's words echoing in her mind. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before she began to type, the words finally falling into place. "What happened to me 2 nights ago is not unusual. It's something that happens every day to people who don't look a certain way, don't dress a certain way, or don't act the way others expect them to act. It's subtle, but it's there. The lingering looks, the assumptions, the whispers. It's the unspoken message that says, you don't belong here. I was judged before I spoke. I was dismissed before I had a chance to be seen. But this isn't just about me. It's about the people who don't have the privilege of walking away. It's about the young woman who is told to try somewhere more affordable. The man who is followed through a store by security. The family who gets seated by the kitchen while others are given the best tables. This isn't just an isolated incident. It's a pattern. And it's time we talk about it. This moment isn't about blame. It's about accountability. It's about asking ourselves what kind of world we want to create and who gets to feel welcome in it. Because everyone deserves dignity. Everyone deserves respect. And it's time we make sure no one has to fight for that in the spaces that should be open to all. I'm sharing this story not because I want pity, but because I want progress. If this resonates with you, if you felt it, seen it, or lived it, then I ask you to share your story too. Let's shine a light on this together. Michelle paused, her heart pounding as she read the words aloud. They felt right, honest, necessary. Barack leaned over her shoulder, his eyes scanning the screen. "That's it," he said softly. Michelle took a deep breath and clicked post. By the time she set her phone down, it was already vibrating with notifications. Comments poured in, messages of support, outrage, and solidarity. Celebrities and activists reshared her statement, adding their own experiences and stories. News outlets picked up the post, flashing headlines across their websites. Michelle Obama speaks out on discrimination in luxury spaces. Former First Lady calls for accountability after restaurant incident. #Respect Matters. Social media explodes with stories of exclusion. Michelle tried to keep up, scrolling through the responses, but they multiplied too quickly to track. Her inbox filled with emails from reporters requesting interviews, advocacy groups offering support, and ordinary people sharing their pain. One message stopped her. "Mrs. Obama, thank you for saying what so many of us feel but are too afraid to say. I work as a hostess in a restaurant just like the one you described, and I see it happen every day. I've always felt powerless to change it. But maybe now we can." Michelle's eyes blurred slightly as she leaned back in her chair. This was why she had spoken up, not to shame a single business, but to give people the courage to speak and the power to demand better. The restaurant responded by mid-morning. Their statement was polished, carefully worded, and utterly predictable. "We deeply regret the experience Mrs. Obama described in her recent statement. We are committed to inclusivity and will immediately implement bias training for our staff to ensure every guest feels welcome in our establishment." It was hollow, Michelle thought. A quick attempt at damage control without addressing the deeper issue. But the backlash wasn't fading. People weren't satisfied with apologies. They wanted proof of change. Barack walked into the room as Michelle was reading the restaurant's response. He glanced at her phone, then at her face. "Not enough?" he asked. Michelle shook her head. "Not even close." Barack sat beside her. "Then what's next?" Michelle didn't hesitate. "We make this bigger. We turn this into something they can't ignore." She grabbed her phone and started making calls. Journalists she trusted, advocates she had worked with, community leaders and organizers. Within hours, the pieces were falling into place. A virtual town hall, a space where people could share their experiences and demand solutions. The next day, as Michelle prepared for the town hall, the response continued to grow. News anchors debated the cultural implications of her post, while commentators dissected the systemic biases embedded in luxury service industries. Outside their home, reporters had started gathering. Camera crews waited for statements, and journalists called out questions whenever Michelle stepped outside. But she didn't stop to answer. Not yet. That evening, Michelle rehearsed her opening remarks for the town hall, her voice steady despite the nerves humming just beneath the surface. She knew what was at stake, not just her own credibility, but the stories of the people who had reached out to her, hoping someone would finally listen. When Barack entered the room, she turned to him and smiled. "You ready for this?" she asked. He smiled back. "Always." And as she stepped toward the camera, the weight of the moment settled over her, not as a burden, but as a responsibility she was ready to carry. The virtual town hall had been scheduled for 7 p.m., but by 6:30, the online waiting room was already filling up. Michelle sat in front of a softly lit backdrop, her laptop screen glowing as messages poured into the live chat. Names from across the country: Atlanta, Chicago, Los Angeles, and smaller towns she'd never heard of, scrolled by in an endless stream. Some messages were brief. "Thank you for speaking up." Others were deeply personal. "I've been turned away from restaurants just like that one. I never thought anyone would care." Michelle's heart clenched as she scrolled through the words. This wasn't just a conversation anymore. It was a reckoning. Barack entered the room quietly, a cup of tea in hand. He set it down beside her and glanced at the screen. "It's bigger than we thought," he said softly. Michelle nodded. "I know." At exactly 7 o'clock, the moderator's voice cut through the chatter. "Thank you all for joining us tonight. We're here to have an honest conversation about discrimination, what it looks like, how it feels, and what we can do to stop it." The screen shifted to Michelle, who straightened in her chair. Her voice, steady but warm, filled the virtual space. "Good evening, everyone. I want to start by thanking you for being here and for trusting us with your stories. This isn't easy. Speaking up about moments of humiliation and exclusion can feel uncomfortable, even painful, but it's necessary. Because when we stay silent, these moments keep happening, not just to us, but to others." She paused, her eyes scanning the screen as more comments poured in. "So proud of you, Michelle. We need this conversation." "I've waited years for someone to say this out loud," Michelle continued, her voice gaining strength. "This isn't just about restaurants or boutiques. It's about workplaces, schools, hospitals. It's about every space where people are judged, dismissed, or ignored because of how they look, where they come from, or what they wear. It's about the single mom who gets side-eyed at a high-end store because her clothes look too casual. It's about the teenager who's followed by security while shopping. It's about the couple who are seated by the bathrooms instead of the windows." The chat exploded with agreement. Michelle leaned forward. "We need to stop pretending these things are harmless. They're not. They tell people, especially young people, that they're not good enough. They chip away at confidence and dignity, and it's time we hold businesses, institutions, and ourselves accountable." She glanced at the moderator, signaling to introduce the first guest. A woman named Andrea appeared on the screen. Her face was framed by glasses, and her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "I'm from Atlanta," Andrea began. "I've worked as a waitress for 6 years, and I've seen so many people treated the way you were, Mrs. Obama. People who came in dressed differently or who looked like they didn't belong. Sometimes they're ignored. Other times they're asked to leave outright. And I've been guilty too. I didn't speak up when I should have." Her voice cracked. "But hearing your story made me realize I need to do better. We all do." Michelle nodded, her expression softening. "Thank you, Andrea. Admitting that takes courage, and change always starts with courage." The next speaker was a young man from Chicago. His video feed clicked on. showing him sitting in a small, dimly lit room. "My name's Marcus," he said. "I'm 19 and I work in retail. I've been followed around stores my whole life. I've been stopped by security. Once, I was told I couldn't afford something before I even asked for the price." He shook his head. "It messes with you. Makes you feel small, like you don't matter." Michelle let his words hang for a moment before responding. "Marcus, you do matter. And you're not alone. What you've experienced, it's not just bad customer service. It's prejudice. And you're right to call it out." As the town hall continued, more faces and voices emerged. A middle-aged woman shared how she'd been refused service at a luxury store because the staff assumed she couldn't pay. A black couple described being ignored in a jewelry store while salespeople flocked to a white customer who had walked in after them. Story after story, the pattern became undeniable. Michelle listened, offering words of encouragement but also action. She laid out steps for accountability, how businesses could train staff, track incidents, and enforce anti-discrimination policies. She talked about advocacy groups that were already doing the work and encouraged people to get involved. But what resonated most was her call for visibility. "We need to make this visible," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "Because when people see it, when they really see it, they can't ignore it anymore. And once they can't ignore it, they can't excuse it." The chat erupted in applause, emojis, and affirmations. "Yes. Truth. Keep going." As the night stretched on, Michelle felt the weight of the stories pressing against her. Heavy, but motivating. She wasn't just hearing grievances, she was witnessing a shift. The final caller of the evening was a teenage girl who had watched the entire discussion with her mother. Her voice was soft, but her words were clear. "Mrs. Obama," she said, "I've always been afraid to speak up when something like this happens to me. But after tonight, I think I can." Michelle's smile was genuine as she responded. "You can. And you just did." When the town hall ended, Michelle sat back, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in hours. Barack entered the room and sat beside her, his arm brushing against hers. "That was powerful," he said quietly. Michelle nodded. "It's just the start." She looked at the screen, still flooded with messages and comments. People were sharing their own stories, offering each other support, and asking what came next. Michelle knew the work was far from over, but for the first time in days, she felt something close to hope. This wasn't just a story anymore, it was a movement. The morning after the virtual town hall, Michelle woke up to find the world had already shifted. Her phone vibrated endlessly with notifications, messages, news alerts, and social media updates. She sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes before reaching for the device, knowing that today would bring more than just reactions. It would bring consequences. Barack was already awake, sitting in the corner of the room with his laptop open. He glanced up when she stirred, offering her a small, knowing smile. "You might want to check the headlines," he said. Michelle unlocked her phone and began scrolling. "A reckoning in retail, Michelle Obama's Town Hall spurs national dialogue. Businesses under fire after Obama's call for accountability. #Respect Matters. Trends for second day as customers share stories of discrimination." The comments poured in beneath the articles. Some were heartfelt expressions of solidarity. Others were outraged denials, accusing Michelle of overreacting or exploiting her platform. But the overwhelming majority told stories like the ones from the night before. Michelle's heart twisted as she read them. This happened to me at a car dealership. They wouldn't even let me test drive the car until I proved I could afford it. I was ignored at a jewelry store, and when my fiancé, who's white, came in, they treated him like a king. I've been serving tables for 10 years. The way we're trained to prioritize certain customers over others, it's real, and it's wrong. Michelle glanced up at Barack. This isn't slowing down. He nodded. No, it's not. By noon, the backlash against businesses had begun. The restaurant at the center of the controversy released a second, more detailed statement, this time acknowledging the specific incident involving Michelle and promising immediate reforms. They pledged to hire a diversity consultant, implement anti-bias training, and review hiring practices. But Michelle wasn't satisfied. It's reactive, she said to Barack as she paced their kitchen. They're only doing this because they got caught. True, Barack agreed, leaning back against the counter. But that doesn't mean it's meaningless. It's a start. And now that the conversation has started, it's not going to stop. He was right. Within hours, other businesses began releasing their own statements, scrambling to distance themselves from accusations of discrimination. Major retailers announced plans for inclusivity workshops. Restaurant groups promised updated training programs. Some even invited Michelle to consult on their reforms, an invitation she politely declined. I'm not here to fix their PR problems, she said during an interview later that day. I'm here to make sure this moment leads to real change. But Michelle also knew that change wouldn't come easily. Not everyone supported her efforts. News commentators debated whether she was using her influence unfairly. Opinion pieces questioned whether one bad experience justified such a public outcry. One headline read, "Privilege or Protest? Michelle Obama faces criticism over restaurant incident." Michelle read the article slowly, taking in the accusations that she was out of touch, that she was blowing the incident out of proportion, that she was using her status to shame hard-working employees. She set the phone down and leaned back, exhaling deeply. Barack entered the room, reading her expression immediately. "What is it?" "Pushback," she said. "The usual." He nodded. "That means you're getting to them." Michelle smiled faintly, but the smile didn't last. She knew the critics wouldn't stop, but she also knew the support outweighed the hate. By the end of the week, the movement had grown larger than anyone expected. People began organizing protests outside businesses with histories of discrimination. Signs reading "Respect Matters" and "We Belong Here" lined sidewalks in cities across the country. Michelle watched the footage on the news, her heart swelling as she saw young people, some carrying signs, others simply standing in solidarity, refusing to back down. And then the letters started coming. One was from a high school senior in Detroit. "Mrs. Obama, I never thought someone like me could walk into places like that. After hearing you speak, I applied for an internship at a local nonprofit that fights discrimination. Thank you for reminding me I have a voice." Another was from a former restaurant manager. "I used to look the other way when staff treated people differently. Your story made me rethink everything. I quit my job and am now helping train businesses on inclusivity." Michelle wiped away a tear as she read them. These weren't just reactions, they were results. But the movement was also having unintended effects. The restaurant where it all began was flooded with negative reviews, forcing it to temporarily close. Protesters gathered outside its doors, chanting slogans and waving signs. Other businesses feared similar backlash, and some began quietly adopting new policies without waiting for media attention. Still, Michelle worried about the sustainability of the momentum. She knew public outrage could burn out as quickly as it flared up. If they wanted real, lasting change, they would have to turn this moment into something more structured, something permanent. That evening, she met with Barack in their living room, notebooks spread across the coffee table. "We need to build something," she said, "something bigger than hashtags and protests." Barack raised an eyebrow. "You're talking about an organization?" Michelle nodded. "Yes, a network, resources for businesses, training programs, support groups for people who've experienced discrimination. And we need to make it easy for people to report incidents like this so they can't be swept under the rug." Barack leaned back and smiled. "I think you've already started it." Michelle laughed softly. "Not intentionally." "No," Barack said, "but movements don't start intentionally. They start because people see something they can't ignore, and you made them see it." Michelle looked down at her notes, already drafting ideas for the next phase of the work. She knew the critics would keep coming, and businesses would resist meaningful change, but she also knew the people who had shared their stories were watching, waiting to see what would happen next. She wasn't going to let them down. As the night stretched on, Michelle continued to write, her resolve hardening. This wasn't just about fighting one incident. It was about building something that could last, a framework for change, so the next time someone walked into a restaurant and felt invisible, they wouldn't have to face it alone. The protests outside the restaurant continued. The letters kept coming. And Michelle kept pushing, knowing that the hardest part was still ahead. Michelle stood in front of the mirror, straightening the simple gold bracelet on her wrist. The room around her was quiet, but her mind was already racing. Today wasn't just another meeting or interview. It was the first step toward something bigger, something lasting. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind. Protests outside the restaurant had continued, forcing it to remain closed indefinitely. Other high-end businesses were scrambling to implement new policies, eager to distance themselves from accusations of discrimination. Some genuinely wanted to change. Others just wanted to avoid bad press. Michelle wasn't naive enough to believe that public pressure alone would fix the problem, but something had shifted. The virtual town hall had sparked conversations in living rooms, offices, and classrooms across the country. For the first time, people were confronting uncomfortable truths about bias, class, and race in spaces designed to keep certain people out. And now, Michelle was ready to channel that energy into action. Barack entered the room, pausing to watch her for a moment before speaking. "You look ready," he said, his voice warm. Michelle turned and smiled. "I am." She picked up the folder sitting on the dresser, her outline for the new initiative she had been building. It was more than just a campaign. It was a network, a coalition of businesses, activists, and community leaders committed to dismantling discrimination in service industries. She had already lined up partners and funding. Today's meeting was about setting the tone for what came next. Barack walked her to the car, pausing before she climbed in. "Whatever happens in there," he said, "you've already changed something." Michelle met his gaze and nodded. "We both have." The ride to the meeting felt longer than it was. Michelle rehearsed her opening remarks in her head, but the faces from the town hall kept intruding. Andrea, Marcus, the teenage girl who had found her voice for the first time. They reminded her why this mattered. When she arrived at the venue, a sleek conference hall lined with glass walls, reporters and photographers were already gathered outside. She stepped out of the car to a flurry of flashing cameras and shouted questions. Mrs. Obama, how do you respond to critics who say this is an overreaction? What do you hope to accomplish with this initiative? Will the restaurant reopen under new management? Michelle kept walking, offering only a polite nod as security guided her inside. She knew better than to let the noise distract her. Inside the hall, the atmosphere felt different. Charged, expectant. Representatives from major brands, small business owners, and activists filled the rows of chairs. Some looked eager, others skeptical, but they were all here. That was a start. Michelle stepped onto the stage, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. The murmurs in the audience died down as she reached the podium. She took a breath and began. "Thank you all for being here," she said. "I know some of you might be wondering why this conversation matters, why a single night at a restaurant sparked protests, headlines, and calls for reform. But this isn't about one night, and it's not about one restaurant." She let the words hang for a moment before continuing. "This is about the quiet ways we tell people they don't belong. It's about the glances, the whispers, the hesitations that say you're not enough. Those moments might feel small to the people who cause them, but to the people who experience them, they're anything but small. They linger. They shape how we see ourselves and how we move through the world. And it has to stop." The room was silent now. Michelle saw some heads nodding, others leaning in. This isn't just about calling out bad behavior. It's about creating better systems that prioritize fairness, empathy, and accountability. That's why I'm proud to introduce the We Belong initiative. We Belong will offer resources to businesses looking to train their staff, implement anti-bias policies, and rebuild trust with the communities they serve. It will also create a national database where people can report incidents of discrimination and share their stories. But this isn't just about businesses, it's about all of us. Because change doesn't start in boardrooms. It starts with people, customers, employees, neighbors who refuse to stay silent. She paused as the audience absorbed her words. Then she smiled, letting her voice soften just slightly. "This is a beginning. It won't fix everything overnight, but it's a step, and sometimes the hardest part of change is taking that first step." The applause started slowly but quickly grew until the room was filled with it. Michelle stepped back from the podium, allowing herself a moment to take it in. After the meeting, she spoke with business leaders who wanted to partner with the initiative. Some admitted their shortcomings openly, while others seemed more interested in optics. But Michelle remained patient, knowing real change would take time. That evening, Michelle and Barack sat together in their living room, scrolling through the day's news coverage. Headlines praised her speech, and clips of her remarks were already circulating online. "Do you think it'll stick?" Michelle asked. Barack didn't hesitate. "You've made people see it. That's the first step. Now we just have to keep building." Michelle leaned her head against his shoulder, allowing herself a rare moment of rest. Outside, the city buzzed on, but for the first time in weeks, Michelle felt grounded. Not because the work was finished, but because it had begun. A few weeks later, Michelle found herself back in another restaurant. Not the one where it all began, but another high-end establishment that had invited her to review their new inclusivity policies. She entered quietly, dressed in a simple but elegant outfit, and immediately noticed the difference. The hostess smiled warmly and greeted her without hesitation. The waitstaff treated her with care, but not performative deference. It felt real. As she sat at her table, sipping water and waiting for her meal, a young waitress approached. "Mrs. Obama," she said nervously. "I just wanted to thank you for what you've done. I was working at another place when this all started, and it made me think about how I treated people. I left that job, and now I'm here. I feel like I'm actually part of something better." Michelle smiled, her heart swelling. "You are," she said, "and don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The waitress beamed and returned to her work, leaving Michelle alone with her thoughts. She looked around the restaurant, seeing not just a change in how people acted, but a shift in what was expected. A shift that had started with a single night, a single insult, and the decision not to stay silent. It wasn't the end. It was never the end. But it was a step forward, and that was enough to keep going. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new episodes. Share this video with your friends and family. Together, we can bring even more attention to important topics. Check out the other videos on the channel. There are many more thought-provoking and inspiring stories. Thank you for being with us.